little short compared to the usual session. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين سيدنا ومولانا نبيه الكريم وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. I begin in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I seek His protection and His refuge. I invoke His peace and blessings upon our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, upon his family members, his loved ones and companions. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to connect us and unify us with them in this life and in the next. Allahumma ameen. Brothers and sisters, assalamu alaikum. It's a pleasure to see you all again. We took a week off for Eid. I hope that time was well spent and you all had an opportunity to be with family and loved ones and friends and celebrate the beautiful days of Eid. We always miss these days, and my son, on the last day of Eid, when we did the last of the takbirat, he was very upset. He was very sad that we won't be doing the takbirat anymore. So I told him, you can keep doing it if you want. It's just a dhikr, but it's only special for Eid. And so he's already looking forward to the coming Eid, right? We're looking forward to next Eid for the takbirat. Alhamdulillah. So we missed those beautiful days, but we know that we have beautiful days ahead of us as well, inshallah. But for today, inshallah, we'll continue our exploration of the surah, not just of the surah, really of the story. Ahsan al-Qasas, the best of stories that has been told by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in His own words, the story of Yousef alayhi salam. And so far we have gone through the multiple phases of his life, and today inshallah I want to focus only on one chapter of his life, and I hope that we'll not just learn some lessons from the story, but also apply those lessons to some ways that those I think are relevant in the modern context. So just to kind of summarize quickly the phases of his life that we have experienced so far. There's the first phase of his life, which he was a child under the care of his father, Yaqub alayhi salam, and it is in that phase that the first sign of his potential prophethood is seen. The dream that he has, that he shares with his father, right? And in that same time, while there's so much good in that moment, there's also trouble brewing in the form of his who? His siblings, his brothers, right? And a reminder, right, among many other reminders, that sometimes the trouble is closer than you think. Sometimes the trouble, the issues are closer to home than we would like. Sometimes the troubles are more internal than they are external. And the dangers of such troubles is that those are the kind of troubles we are apt to ignore. Those are the ones that we're more likely to overlook and just not pay attention to because we feel safe and comfortable in our environments. And so, just this time in his life where trouble is brewing, like I said, closer to home, he must have learned so much from that experience. And then is the phase of his life that begins when he is in the well, right? And in the well, he receives assurance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Some of the commentators are of the opinion that that's actually the onset even of his status as a prophet. Others say no, it comes later, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala still speaks to him as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does speak to others who are not prophets and messengers as well. We see that in the Quran on various occasions, right? So this stage begins in the well, right? This is the stage that is, that is a difficult stage, but one in which Yousef alayhi salam seems to still develop and grow, and is not damaged by the experiences. He's not deeply traumatized in a way that he cannot move past what happens. Right? He's sold into slavery, but fortunately, out of this apparently difficult situation, he ends up in a pretty good position. Right? He ends up in the house of one of the ministers, and that particular minister, is kind and gentle with him and says, maybe we'll even take him as a son. And so there's this particular phase, right? So, kind of the opposite lesson. A lesson that sometimes the very thing that we fear the most, sometimes, the deepest, darkest, scariest of wells that we might fall into, could also result in unexpected blessings, an unexpected opportunity, like the opportunity that is afforded to Yousef alayhi salam, right? So we're seeing these kind of two, not opposite lessons, but complementary lessons, right? Already in the young life of Yousef alayhi salam, and remember the reason I argued that this is the best of stories, one of the reasons is that it has something for everyone. It has something for every single person to take. So if you are in a situation of comfort, but with some trouble brewing underneath, you learn from the story of Yousef. And if you are in a situation of great trouble and difficulty, but with potential, on the other side of the darkness, then too you have something to learn from the story of Yousef alayhi salam. And then we went through the phase of his life that was marked by the, his kind of growth, his upbringing, or his coming of age, I should say. And in this time, remember, we realized, what we talked about was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala seems to do like a survey of all of the different kinds of social ills that plague a society, that corrupt a society. I'm sure that maybe you guys all remember all of the different ills, so I won't quiz you on that, but I want to just point out at least some of them that were relevant. Remember that the caravan that picked up Yousef, they reflected a certain kind of ill, right? The illness that they symbolized was this kind of immorality. Immorality is all of it, but this kind of materialism, right? That money is the bottom line, right? That's the name of the game. Everything else is valued based on its monetary value, right? And that's how they establish their sense of worth in anything, right? And so when they find Yousef, they look at him and they see a bag of money, right? They don't really see much else. And it's so ironic because they really can't sell him for much because he's, I forget what the term is when something is like stolen goods, hot goods, I don't know, maybe something like this. I can't remember. I'm not very good at stolen stuff. Alhamdulillah. But it's like, they can't really sell for much because they really got to get him off the shelf because they're worried that it might be traced back to them and they could get in trouble. So they don't make much money off of them anyways, even though money is their highest value, right? And then there's the kind governor, right? And his wife, who turns out to be quite treacherous. So we couldn't really see what his immorality was, but we started to see hers when Yousef started to come to age. Hers was a kind of hedonism and a kind of narcissism. That, my pleasure is the ultimate decider of what is valuable. How do I know something is good? If it makes me feel happy. How do I know something is not good? Well, it doesn't make me happy, right? So it's this kind of hedonism and also narcissism, but I think hedonism is the primary, point here that she reflects. And then we do realize after we find her immorality, we see his as well, the governor, right? Who was a decent human being, it seems, but not perfect, and clearly not perfect in this regard, when he reveals his immorality to be what? It's in how he responds to his wife's crimes, right? And what does he do? He responds with cowardice, right? He doesn't want himself or her to suffer the consequences and the difficulty of, bearing the consequences of what has been done. And so he just tells her, he tells Yousef, forget about it, don't worry about this. And he tells her, make tawbah, and that's kind of it, right? He does not hold her accountable. He does not hold, the entire situation to account. He acts with cowardice and with appeasement, right? And that too is a great social ill, right? So many people stand by and watch something horrific happen because they feel that it's too difficult for them to do something about it. They feel fear for losing something of themselves, right? And you'll see this play out in so many situations where, a few people, just a few, right, are pushing for some immoral behavior. And many, many people feel that it's wrong. They don't feel good about it in their hearts, but they just stay silent and they stay out of the way because they don't want to suffer the consequences, right? And so these are like surveys of these social ills that we go through. And then we come to the next chapter in the life of... and we also had this reminder of society at large. Society at large had another immorality that was worth noticing in the example of the women who were cutting their hands, right? And I made the point to you all that it wasn't like every single time somebody saw Yousef they were cutting their hands, right? It was this particular group of women. So it's a reflection of them in particular, the elites of this society, right? And first they gossip and they mock her, and then they want to fan these flames, and then they themselves are a reflection of her immoral behavior. They themselves are so taken by their lusts and their desires, right? And we made the point that this is the point on sexual, particularly on sexual immorality, and I was trying to drive home the idea that this kind of immorality and this kind of unregulated behavior, it cripples people, right? It truly holds people down and holds people back, and it takes time for people to heal from this because it's potentially everywhere. And I even mentioned that it interferes with even the basics of life, and that was the symbolism behind them cutting their hands, right? Cutting your hand, it's the worst place to cut yourself, right? Of course, there's more deadly places, but it's the place that is going to really mess with you for an extended period of time because it's going to take so long for that to heal. You can't do anything with that hand. And it just interferes with the most basic things, picking up the keys and my cut, right? A little paper cut is irritating, when it's on the hand, right? So this was a summary, and now to actually go into the next phase of the life of Yousef alayhi salam is the phase in which he goes to jail. And the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala starts this phase, I won't read through all of the ayat. I'll just try and highlight the specific keywords and things, but at least to begin, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that Yousef alayhi salam calls out to Allah. قال رب السجن أحب إلي مما يدعونني إليه. Oh Allah, prison is more beloved to me. I would rather be in jail than be invited or be tempted to go into what they call me to. وإلا تصرف عني كيدهن أصب إليهن وأكن من الجاهلين. This is a really important part of the ayah to understand the mindset of Yousef alayhi salam. So first of all, he says, I would rather go to jail, right? Which is an extreme thing to say, right? So you can interpret this in a couple of ways. One way is, usually when we are under extreme stress and under an immense amount of pressure, we respond with that same kind of energy and that same kind of extremeness, right? So somebody, if your kids feel something once, you're like, okay, whatever. But if they do it every single day, you start to really lose it, right? I'm gonna set every can of milk on fire, right? You start you react in this way because it's just so bothersome to you now. You respond in this exaggerated way. So this is one way to interpret the statement, "Oh Allah, I would rather be in jail." Right? Another way to interpret this statement is to give Yousef a little more credit and say that maybe he understood something about his current situation in society, and maybe he understood what was the only other consequence. The only way out of this, he may have understood already, is that since they're not getting in trouble and they're not suffering the consequences, fine, let me get in trouble and let me go to jail so that I'm away from this. One way or the other, I need to get out of this, right? And actually, the way that he starts his second statement after he says, I would rather be in jail, وَإِلَّا تَصْرِفْ عَنِّي كَيْدَهُنَّ. If you don't remove from me their plan. If you don't remove from me their plan, it's like kind of a backwards way of saying it. He's not saying if you don't remove me from their plan. He's saying if you don't remove their plan from me, right? So he's almost like implying the flip-flop nature of what I was saying that he might be thinking. Like, okay, if you don't put them in jail or put them in trouble or make them suffer the consequences, then put me in that situation so that I can at least be out of this, right? And then he says, if you don't remove from me their plan, asbu ilayhinna, I might incline towards them. And asbu is interesting. It comes from the word saba yasbu, which means to be childlike, to be childish. Well, what is childish about what they're calling him to? Why does he use that phrase? I think the most appropriate explanation, and the reason Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses this particular word, the reason Yousef alayhi salam says it in this way is that what's the difference between a child and an adult when it comes to consequences? The adult has figured it out, right? If I touch the fire, my hand is going to burn, right? The child may not have figured it out yet, right? And it takes time and it takes multiple kind of exposures for the child to okay, I probably shouldn't touch that, right? Sometimes it just requires once, but sometimes it's after 10 or 15 different reminders, they finally start to get it, if they start to get it, right? And so what he's saying is, I might lose the focus that I have right now on the consequences. One of the things that keeps people moral is their understanding that immoral behavior has consequences. And so he's saying, they keep calling me, and they keep calling me, and I'm a human being. And eventually, that might affect me and cause me to cave and to actually forget about the consequences, right? وَأَكُمْ مِنَ الْجَاهِلِينَ, and I would be like the ignorant ones, or I would be from the ignorant ones, right? So again, referring to becoming ignorant of the consequences. Is it possible for someone to know something, theoretically, and then just all of a sudden not know it? Or if I tell somebody, that immoral behavior has consequences, is it possible for them to just completely forget that idea? Maybe, but what's more possible, what's more likely, is for them to internalize the desire to sin that overrules what they know on the kind of the surface of their brains. So maybe on the face of it, somebody who's sinning, they know doing this sin results in these bad deeds. But even though they know they can speak it, they don't have the ability to act in a different way because deeper down they don't actually know it at that level, right? And this is the kind of jahilin that Yousef alayhi salam is referring to. I don't want to become that kind of jahil. Jahil is not just somebody who's ignorant. Jahil is somebody whose behavior looks ignorant, even though they might be able to articulate in the most eloquent of ways, right? And how many people do we see in the world today who are the most articulate, yet they reflect the most jahil of ideas, right? So just eloquence or sophistication does not reflect a sense of true knowledge, right? There's plenty of things that we know on a surface level, and yet we don't act upon, in terms of our actual behavior and our habits. Important note. Should we do it now?
Let's do 7:30.
7:30. Inshallah, 7:30. All the youth have to go take themselves to the youth lounge. Inshallah. Number 34. Ayah number 34. This is where Allah Subhanahu wa Taala responds. Right? Allah Subhanahu wa Taala says, فَاسْتَجَابَ لَهُ رَبُّهُ فَصَرْفَ عَنْهُ كَيْدَهُنَّ. So Allah Subhanahu wa Taala responds to his dua, and إِنَّهُ هُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْعَلِيمُ. Allah is all-knowing, all-hearing. This ayah, it reminds us that we need to be mindful of how we make dua to Allah Subhanahu wa Taala. So if Yousef alayhi salam in his request was, just saying jail because it was like his, exaggerated or his kind of like reactionary response, what kind of things do we make dua for because we're getting emotional, because we're getting reactive, right? And would we really make dua for those things if we truly understood the long-term consequences? Would we really make dua for those things if we understood, that, yeah, it looks really nice to you, but it might be actually really bad for you, right? It might be nice for your, for your bank account, but it might be horrible for your character. It might be nice for your family, but it might be horrible for your children, right? If we really think through in a longer scheme, in a grander scheme, we might realize, I probably shouldn't be making dua for that, right? And so it's, part of the adab of making dua that you say to Allah, Ya Allah, grant for me what you know is best for me, right? And make dua not just for the item that you want, not just for the thing, but make dua for the purpose for which you made dua for the thing, right? So you're not saying, Ya Allah, grant me a really nice phone, but you're saying, Ya Allah, grant me the tools to be able to connect with my family, or to be able to do my work in the most efficient way possible, right? Those are the kinds of du'as that are truly insightful and thoughtful, right? Make dua for meaningful things and not just for items to which you have associated meaning. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts his dua as he makes it, right? He grants his dua for jail, whether he meant it or not. I think I like the idea more that he did mean it. I feel like Yousef alayhi salam is a man of insight, and we'll see that as we go. But not all of us are, right? Continuing in the next few ayat, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes how he accepted the dua, right? So remember, although so far we were talking about, let me just go back a few ayats here. Right, we were talking about kaydihunna, right? Because for those of you who understand the Arabic, kaydihunna was in ayah number 33, and then فَصَرَفَ عَنْهُ kaydahunna. Again, what does hunna mean? Anybody? Hunna, this pronoun, it's referring to the group of women, right? The plotting of this group of women, or the plan of this group of women, right? And now suddenly Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala changes the pronoun. He says, ثُمَّ بَدَا لَهُمْ مِنْ بَعْدِ مَا رَأَوُا الْآيَاتِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala instead, right, while all of the ministers getting involved, let us imprison him for, who are her friends? He's the governor, or he's the minister, right? That's who is involved in this whole thing, right? And so it's, they come home, the cuts and what's going on, and rumors are starting to spread, right? So now we perceive our little small sins, right? No one's going to know, it's private, and then it explodes. There's something way bigger, right? And that's what's happened here. It's become a scandal amongst the elite and amongst their servants, and everyone's talking about it, and oh, did your mistress have a cut on her hands too? Yeah, mine did too. Or she must have been that thing. I heard, this is what's happening, right? All these kind of rumors flying around. And so the governors, the ministers feel that they have to do something about this situation. And what's their solution? Let's just put Yousef in jail for a while. So somebody goes and asks him, or somebody wants to know what actually happened. They can't access him. Put him away for a little bit. And they say, حَتَّى حِينٍ, for a while. They don't intend to imprison him the whole time, because they don't actually think he's guilty of anything. They just put the guy away for a little while so we have to deal with this, right? And we'll let him out at some point. We'll take care of it, right? And so this is their solution, right? This is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts the dua of Yousef, through the plotting and the trickery and the treachery of others. I also think it's important to consider that all of a sudden they're interested in consequences. Right? Remember, these are the people who cares about consequences? Now they're interested in consequences, right? Well, if we leave him out, people are going to ask him, he's going to tell them what happened, right? So they care about consequences, but what type of consequences do they care about? The only consequences that they care about are the consequences of this dunya, right? They're still not interested in any moral consequences, because they have no moral foundation. They have no notion of God and objective morality that comes from God. So that's why they're considerate of the consequences, because it actually starts to hurt them, right? And this, reminds us why people ask, why does God have hell? Why have hell? Okay, just have Jannah, right? But if you don't have hell, or you have nothing that's going to, spark and kind of wake people up and get them to realize, hey, there are serious negative consequences as well for your actions, right? So the moment they start to feel the potential negative consequences, from a dunya perspective, they start to act, right? Therefore, we understand the importance of, ideas like Jahannam as well, right? The idea is not so that people will burn, but so that people will stop. People will prevent themselves. When Yousef alayhi salam enters into the prison, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, وَدَخَلَ مَعَهُ السِّجْنَ فَتَيَانِ. Two young men were imprisoned. They were kind of, all three of them were being imprisoned together. So Yousef and two other young men, right? And so these two men, they start to get into conversation with Yousef. You're being booked, and you're in the same jail cell, and the judge sees you at the same time, and then he throws all three of you in the same prison cell, and puts you on the same schedule, and you're on the same low rung of whatever status and society exists within prison. You kind of build a little bit of connection to each other, right? Regardless of what the background is, this shared experience, and through this shared experience, they start to speak to Yousef alayhi salam. قال أحدهما إني رآني أعصر خمرا. He says, one of them says, I had this dream. And he says, إني رآني, right? He says, I saw in my dream, but he says, I'm seeing in my dream. What does that mean about the dream? That he's still asleep? No. It's a continuous dream. He keeps having it, right? You saw it once, okay, that's weird, right? I guess I like juice, so I saw a dream of me, pouring some juice. Great. You see it again and again and again, you're like, hey, something's up. What is this dream? I keep having this dream, right? I keep seeing myself squeezing juice, right? Arani, I keep seeing myself. And the other man also, he speaks up too. Yeah, actually I'm having a weird dream too. وقال الآخر إني أراني أحمل فوق رأسي خبزا تأكل الطير منه. I am seeing again and again in my dream that I have some bread on my head and there are crows that are eating from this bread. Right? It's such a strange dream, right? And so they both share their dreams with Yousef alayhi salam. Now, it's not just that they started to share their dreams because they had some camaraderie and other things. When you develop some shared experience like these three are, right? They're going to prison together, right? You still share with each other the things that you think are relevant, right? So it's interesting to note that they didn't start talking about what their crime was, right? One wasn't I tried to murder the minister. Oh, I tried to steal from his jewelry. Oh, I tried to seduce his wife. That's not what's happened, right? Because they don't see that in Yousef alayhi salam. What do they see in him that causes them to share this kind of information instead? Well, in the end of the ayah, they explain why. They say, "Inna naraka minal muhsinin." Because they say, we were looking at you, and you don't look like a criminal to us. You don't look like a guy who belongs here, right? We look at you and we see someone who's from the muhsinin. Right? Muhsinin is we see a virtuous person. Right? We see a person who wouldn't commit a crime. A person who is mindful of their behavior. Right? And that's why they start to share this dream, because they really don't have much else to relate. Right? There's actually a story that some of the scholars of tafsir, they narrate as to why, why these two ended up in prison, and that the two of them are actually associated to each other. The story may or may not be authentic, but I think it's worth sharing because many of the scholars do share it. They mention that these two men both used to work in the household of one of the ministers, possibly even the king, right? And there was an attempted poisoning of the minister and or king where they used to live. And one of them was in charge of making the bread, and one of them was in charge of pouring the drinks. And so they were the two likely guilty parties, right? And so they were the two that were imprisoned, and the system, the judicial system, decided we'll figure out which one is guilty later. One of them, is certainly guilty, that we'll figure it out, kind of a thing. And so they're both in prison for now, right? And that's the potential background story. Like I said, it's neither confirmed nor rejected, but it is shared by many of the scholars of tafsir. But what's, I think, valuable, from this particular ayah, this moment here, is that people, even if they are themselves criminals or they themselves have, committed some grave sin, even if they are mushrik, etc., people can detect virtue. They can tell, right? They can tell when somebody is a more virtuous person. And the reason I think they can tell is because virtue and goodness and good behavior crosses the lines of faith even, right? Our faith teaches us and gives us the most direct mechanism by which we can be virtuous people. It makes us virtuous people. But generally, we know that if we live in a society or in a family or a group where most of us behave virtuously, then most of us will be better off. Whereas if we know that we live in a society where, one person or two people cheat, those people will probably make it, further than the rest, and the rest will suffer. And so, generally, we are more willing to live in a society where things are more virtuous, right? Because maybe none of us will, go way beyond everyone else, but, all of us will be, for the most part, okay. All of us will generally be have enough, kind of a thing, right? And we'd rather have enough and be well with other people that we love than lose all those people and just be well on our own. People can, like I said, naturally they detect virtue, and so they detect that in Yousef alayhi salam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continues the story in the following ayat. When Yousef alayhi salam, so they tell him their dream. They're saying, we want you to interpret this dream. Give us the interpretation. What do you think about this dream? And Yousef alayhi salam prepares to interpret their dream. But first, he has to establish some boundaries. He has to establish some context. He has to establish some purpose as to why he's going to do this. Right? So he says, before your meals will arrive, I will give you the interpretation of your dream. Right? I will give that to you. But why is he saying this? Why is he telling them, before your meals arrive, I'll give you the... Why doesn't he just say, you this and you that? Why does he have to start explaining? What is he trying to do?
They're patient.
So they're patient because he needs them to give him a little bit of their time. He's basically saying, look, I need a short amount of your time. It's a short amount. Dinner's coming. By the time dinner gets here, you will have the interpretation of your dream. But until then, I need you to give me your full attention. I need you to focus. Okay? Don't get distracted. Don't get disheartened. Just focus with me. Walk through this conversation with me, and you will have what you want, right? He's buying time because he can't just give them the interpretation. That's not enough. Somebody wants, a child wants a milkshake, right? Is crying for a milkshake, but really what the child wants is nourishment, right? And the type of nourishment that they would prefer at this moment is maybe the type that isn't really the best type of nourishment for them, right? It's one thing to just give them the milkshake when they ask for it, and give them the M&Ms when they ask for it, and give them the whatever else that they ask for, and the popsicle, or you say, you sound hungry, let's get something to eat, and after you finish, you still have some room, we'll have some dessert. Right? That's what a responsible person does. Yousef alayhi salam has to be responsible towards his newfound friends. And so he tells them, I need some of your time because I got to tell you multiple things here. I'm not just going to give you the interpretation of the dream. So what's the first thing he starts to tell them? He starts to tell them in ayah number 37. Where are we? Ayah number 37. Yes. ذَلِكُمَا مِمَّا عَلَّمَنِي رَبِّي. All of the things that I'm about to tell you, I have been told, I have received from my Lord. I have received from God. Right? So I'm going to give you the interpretation. And I have the ability. But by the way, I got this ability from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? And then he starts to talk about his own experiences. إِنِّي تَرَكْتُ مِلَّةَ قَوْمٍ لَا يُؤْمِنُونَ بِاللَّهِ وَهُمْ بِالْآخِرَةِ هُمْ كَافِرُونَ. I have abandoned the ways and the lifestyles of people who neither do they believe in Allah, nor do they believe, and on top of not believing in Allah, they reject that there is an afterlife and any accountability in that afterlife. Right? So this is where he starts. Right? Because he wants to give them the context of the knowledge. The reason I can interpret your dreams is because I have this knowledge from Allah. And by the way, this is not what you're used to. Right? This is not information that you're used to, because I have rejected the ways of this society where people neither believe in Allah nor do they believe in the afterlife. And why does he point out Allah in the afterlife? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not just the divine, but also for them in this worldly life is a reflection of morality. That's kind of what we've been saying this entire time, right? Anytime we talk about morality missing, it's because Allah is missing. Right? The foundation of that morality is missing. And so he's saying, I reject the ways of a people who don't even have morality, because they don't have Allah. And I reject the ways of a people who do not have accountability, because accountability is symbolized by al-akhirah, right? The afterlife, where we will be held to account and we will suffer, right? You're not going to get the interpretation of the dreams unless you get this first, right? And then he continues to explain, right? He gives them some history, right? وَاتَّبَعْتُ مِلَّةَ آبَائِ إِبْرَاهِيمَ وَإِسْحَاقَ وَيَعْقُوبَ. I have followed the way and the tradition of my forefathers, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Right? So he makes a reference to the historical, he makes a reference to the stories behind his faith. Right? When we learn Islam, one of the things that we love to learn about is Islamic history. Right? It strengthens our faith. It helps us to understand the faith. It's not just theories. Our faith is not just ideas on a piece of paper, but they are things that have practical applications in lives. And the very first examples of those practical applications is Islamic history and the seerah of the Prophet. Right? So he's doing something similar. Right? He's giving them historical context now. Right? And he tells them what is the point of all of that historical context. مَا كَانَ لَنَا أَن نُشْرِكَ بِاللَّهِ مِنْ شَيْءٍ. All of this history, it's all about one thing. We do not associate partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We don't commit shirk. Again, he's going back, he's giving the history a purpose. Right? We don't just learn the seerah of the Prophet and then we're like, wow, that was a really cool story, right? We learn it because there's some lessons, like we're doing right now, there's some lessons involved, right? And so he's doing the same thing. There are lessons involved. What's the lesson? We don't do shirk, right? We don't believe in any partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? And then he continues. After he gives them that, the kind of context of how he has this knowledge. He reminds them about morality and accountability. He gives them some history lessons from his own, forefathers. Then he goes back to another method of explanation. He starts to use logic, right? He says, "Ya صاحبي السجن أأرباب متفرقون خير أم الله الواحد القهار." He says, "Oh, my companions of the prison, my prison buddies, is it better that there are multiple conflicting gods, or is it better that there is one God who is alone and supreme? What's better? What does it sound like?" This is a logical argument, right? And you can actually follow this logical argument. I don't want to completely, sidetrack our conversation with the actual argument, but there is actually a logical argument that, debates between the idea of monotheism and polytheism, and logically demonstrates why monotheism is the only reasonable solution, right? And polytheism doesn't make sense, right? So he makes reference to this logical argument, right? By the way, he's debating between monotheism and polytheism because he's talking to people who have what in their background? Polytheism, right? They're not atheists, right? They're not atheists, they are polytheists, right? And I'm sure they probably brought up their own beliefs, right? And then he continues his conversation with them, and he says something to them which makes me think that they must have said something to him first. He says, "ما تعبدون من دونه إلا أسماء سميتموها ما تعبدون من دونه إلا أسماء سميتموها أنتم وآباؤهم." What I worship, what you worship, is nothing like the thing that I'm worshiping, or the things that you worship and the names that you mention to me, right? These various names of these various gods, these are made up by you and your forefathers. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has never sent anything like this. مَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ بِهَا مِن سُلْطَانٍ. Now Allah has never sent anything like this, right? So he's telling them, the stuff that you're responding to me with, like, oh, you mean this God? What about that God? What about this? None of it has anything to do with what I'm telling you right now. And this is useful, and I think it's insightful, because usually when you tell people who are want to learn more about your religion and your faith tradition, people who you're making da'wah to, either their response is like, no, get away from me, and they want to fight and argue back. But there's also the other group, right, who's interested. And usually when they're interested, they start to do this thing, they start to relate it to their own belief system. Right? They start to, oh, yeah, that's just like in my religion where we do this and that. Or that's just like in my religion where we worship this. Or, oh yeah, we also do this thing. We don't do it 5 times, we do it 1 time a month, right? So they start to make these connections, and Yousef a.s. is probably experiencing something similar, and he's telling them, guys, it's not the same. They're not connected. They're not related. And don't relate them in your head. Right? This is actually one of the great mistakes that Christians made over time, is that as they encountered new peoples and new traditions and new holidays, and people were like, well, that's kind of like our thing, they just incorporated it, right? And it just kept gobbling up other religious traditions and making it its own, right? And you read about this religious tradition that is Christianity, that is supposed to be monotheistic, and it has marked every single step of the way with layers and layers of polytheism, right? To the point where they cannot help but come up with a doctrine that is, polytheistic, which is the Trinity, right? That's how deep it's gotten, right? So Yousef a.s. is rejecting this, and don't make these connections. It's not the same. You doing this sacrifice for your false god is not the same as us, sacrificing a lamb or a sheep on Eid al-Adha. It's not the same. Right? They don't come from the same source. They don't have the same purpose or meaning. So he's drawing that differentiation for them. And then he finally he tells them the interpretation of the dream. After he goes through this process, right? He gives them the context and everything, gives them the arguments, thinks that they're okay, they're ready, but also, dinner's coming, right? Because he told them, I'm going to take a short amount of your time. And he was honest about his time, right? And by the way, this is like a personal pain for me that I always feel. Like when it's Eid prayer, we always tell people, like, guys, 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. And like we really do want to start at 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. But then, because there's like 3,000 people walking, these days it's not 3,000, but even in these smaller Eids that we did in the last year, because there's like still like 150, 200 people walking towards the place. I feel so sorry for those people, and I have to delay, right? And then as those people are coming because they're delayed, then more people are parking and they're getting out of their cars, right? And I feel guilty towards the people who got there on time, but it's something. Eid is something we do together, right? And so I end up, it's the habit. We end up delaying, but I really wish we weren't in that situation. I really wish we weren't like that, right? Because we said we're going to take a certain amount of time. We should just take that amount of time, right? And that's going to have to be something that we as a community work on, not just one individual. It can't just be, the staff members at the masjid who are always on time, right? It can't just be like, to this day, every single time I get invited to a wedding, usually to officiate, but even outside of that at this point, people always tell me like, oh, we told people 6, so you be there at 7:30. That shouldn't be a reality, right? We should just say this is the amount of time we're going to take, and this is it. And I remember one time, somebody told me, this is the time of the wedding, and oh no, we plan to start on time, and I was like, man, this is awesome. I'm so proud of these people. And I got there, and the wedding didn't start till 3 hours later. I'm going to keep hoping and praying, inshallah, one day. And I know I'm not the only one, brothers and sisters. There's many of us in the community who prefer to do things on time, and yet we, as a community, hinder our progress here. I want to get to the point of this phase, so I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. The Yousef alayhi salam, he tells the interpretation of the dream. And just to quickly summarize for you, the dream, the first dream, where the man is squeezing juice, Yousef alayhi salam tells him that you will return to the household of your master, and you will serve drinks in his household, right? And the other one says, actually, first it tells him you will return to the household of the king, and you will serve drinks there, right? And the other one, he tells him, you will be crucified tomorrow. Right? You will be found guilty of the crime of attempting to murder, and possibly he was actually guilty, and you will be crucified tomorrow for that, and the crows will eat from your head. That's why you see the bread over your head and the birds pecking at it, right? So these are the two dreams. He offers the two interpretations, and then the two have very different responses, right? The one who receives the good news that he will be free, and not only that, but he'll have a really nice job, he's super happy and super excited. And the other one is super upset and mad, right? And it's a reminder of how we respond when we receive, information or we receive news from our deen, right? When we learn something from Islam that is difficult on us, how do we respond? Versus when we learn something that we wanted to hear in the first place, how do we respond? We like something about Islam, we're so happy, and I'm proud to be Muslim, right? And then we don't understand something, or we don't like a ruling, we're like, questioning, the existence of God Himself. It's very selfish, right? Very, very silly way to interpret a way of life. And so when that happens, he goes to the one who is happy because he's gotten good news, and he tells him, when you return, mention my name in front of your master. Just say my name so that they'll know me, they'll recognize my name. Just mention my name, right? And of course they would, because he was supposed to just be there for a little while. It seems as though they've just forgotten him there. They've just left him for a while, right? And so, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in ayah number 42, that Shaitan made him to forget فَأَنْسَاهُ الشَّيْطَانُ ذِكْرَ رَبِّهِ. Now, either this means he made him forget to mention Yousef alayhi salam, or this means he made him forget to mention anything, meaning he made him forget all of Islam. Right? He was in jail, he learned Islam, right? And then he's out and he just forgot, right? Because he just got what he wanted out of it and then he moved on with his life. And Yousef alayhi salam remained in prison for many years thereafter, as the ayah says, bid'i sineen, which means like an extended number of years. Until, and this is kind of alluding to next time we go over the story of Yousef, until the next phase of the story begins, in which the king has this dream. And this dream, just as a sneak peek, this dream has extremely important consequences. Yet, nobody is able to interpret this dream. Right? Nobody except for Yousef alayhi salam, who is rotting away in prison. And a reminder for us of how much danger we put ourselves in as a society and as a community when we allow corruption and the breaking of rules and the kind of society becoming so rigid. We allow that to oppress people. And how many people are being oppressed by that corruption, by those breaking of rules, and by that kind of rigidness of society. How many people are being oppressed, and some of them might actually be the key to our society or our civilization's salvation, right? How many good people who could actually be of great service to our nation, or of great service to our community, or of great service to our Ummah, are being oppressed by the corruption that we have let in so many different ways. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect us from such a situation, to revive our Ummah, and to help us to free those who are struggling and suffering with oppression. Allahumma ameen. I will stop there and see if there's any questions, and inshallah we can probably get ready for Maghrib. Any questions about the phase of the life of Yousef alayhi salam? Yes, sister. Salam.
I have a question on ayah 42. I don't understand the part where he says to mention my name in the presence of Shaitan. Why did he want him to mention his name, and why did that cause him to say that?
Yeah, so basically what Yousef alayhi salam he does is he goes to the one who he knows will survive, and he knows that this man will go on to have a job in the household of one of the ministers. And the reason Yousef alayhi salam is in prison in the first place is because the ministers, all of them, whose wives were at that gathering where they all cut their hands, all those husbands, those ministers, they conspired together to put Yousef in prison. And they said, hatta heen, we'll just put him there for a little bit of time. Just until the controversy, the scandal boils over. But the scandal has boiled over, and they're politicians with lots of money and lots of influence and power, and they've essentially just either forgotten or just neglected it. They don't really care to do much about it. Yousef's out of our hair, whatever, it's fine. So he is saying to this man that who will go back to one of those ministers' houses, when you are with your master, please mention my name. Like maybe he'll remember and think, we should probably get that kid out of prison. We put him there unfairly in the first place. But what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says here is فَأَنْسَاهُ الشَّيْطَانُ فَأَنْسَاهُ الشَّيْطَانُ الذِّكْرَ رَبِّي, which either means Shaitan made him forget to mention to his master, ذِكْرَ رَبِّي, meaning his remembrance to his own master, or it means Shaitan made him to forget all of the mention of his master, and this is actually a reference to Allah. So remember, this prisoner learned about Islam in prison, and not only did he forget about Yousef alayhi salam, but he forgot about everything Yousef told him, and he forgot all of Islam, and this whole amazing episode with the dream. He was just like, whatever, I'm free, I'm happy, right? It didn't even click to him at this point that the guy who interpreted my dream was 100% spot on, because he's just so overtaken with his own excitement that he's free. I'm free, and then he stops thinking about the reason, or not the reason. Well, yes, the reason why he's free, the will of Allah, and the the reason he was optimistic in the first place that he would be free, and who told him that he would be free and interpreted his dream. So this whole thing was forgotten by the man, and that's the interpretation that I take. So that's why Yousef stays longer, because the politicians still don't hear of Yousef. They just forgot about him, right? Until something happens that triggers the drink pourer to say, oh, wait a minute, I know a guy who interprets dreams. And inshallah, we'll get there next time we discuss the story of Prophet Yousef alayhi salam. Any other questions? Going once. Going twice. Yes.
So did minister's wife really love the Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam?
Well, I think the word I would use is she lusted for him. Love is something built over time. When people say like, "Oh, I fell in love," and I think that's just an oxymoron, right? We don't fall into something good, right? If you're falling in it, it's probably not good. It's probably something horrible, right? And dark and deep and dangerous at the very bottom, right? It should make you rise and be better. So, did she love him? I don't think that somebody who is that narcissistic and hedonistic and self-serving as she was at that phase of her life, I don't think that such a person can actually genuinely love. The only thing that they can value is themselves, and so there's no way for them to love somebody outside of them. The moment they stop serving their purposes, the love is gone. Like the moment, remember they both ran towards the door, and she grabbed his shirt from the back, and he got to the door, and then the door opened, and who was there? Her husband. And what did she say? I'm so sorry, but I just love him so much. No, she said, what are you going to do to this guy who is trying to do something, inappropriate with your wife? So, no, I don't think she loved him at that point. I don't think she was capable of love. But there is, we're getting way ahead of ourselves, there is, in some of these, the tafasir, there is mention that afterwards, after Yousef alayhi salam himself becomes one of the ministers, and the wife who was trying to seduce him, her husband, he was much older and he passed away, and now she's a widow, and she comes back to Yousef alayhi salam and she says, I was so wrong and forgive me. And then Yousef alayhi salam actually forgives her and decides to take her as a wife. There is an interpretation, but there is such a story. But that is also one of the stories that is neither, it's not necessarily authentic, so it's neither confirmed nor denied. It comes from the Israeliyat, from the Judeo-Christian tradition. So we don't reject it, but we don't accept it either. Any other questions? Alhamdulillah. Jazakallah khair for your time. Inshallah, next time we go over the story, the rise of Yousef alayhi salam and the salvation of his society. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك ونشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت ونستغفرك ونتوب إليك. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. Brothers and sisters, let's get ready for